S.T.A.L.K.E.R Shadow of Chernobyl was one of the first games I wanted to play when I got into PC gaming many moons ago. It had this reputation for realism and brutal difficulty that was both intimidating and exciting at the time. What I'd heard about the game being hard though was an understatement. The first mission, where you have to infiltrate a bandit base to rescue a fellow stalker, led to my death countless times at the hands of a seemingly self-aware AI that moved around, tried to flank me, and the soldiers were incredibly accurate. I was used to Doom, and I'd played that on consoles with a controller, so that's where I was coming from. Ill-prepared. I would say that S.T.A.L.K.E.R Shadow of Chernobyl was a baptism of fire when it came to PC first-person shooters for me. I persevered though, progressing to a certain point where you encounter this first mutant entity. I'll try to avoid plot spoilers, but suffice to say, for a PC noob, this encounter melted my brain, just like the mutant was trying to do in the game. I just couldn't see a way to defeat it. The way the perspective smash cut back to it and back to you as it threw you about telepathically, it was truly shocking. I'm happy to say it's still effective in 2023. The graphics more broadly starting to show their age, and there's some archaic gameplay quirks, but those elements that made Shadow of Chernobyl so appealing back in 2007, the bleakness of the world, the brutal difficulty, the relative realism of the gun combat, still resonate in 2023. Sometimes it even makes more of an impact given global geopolitics right now. There is a certain sequence where you're making your way through the deserted ruins of the city of Pripyat with a squad of soldiers, watching the windows for enemy snipers. You really feel like you're in the middle of a war zone at that point, the sound design being a big part of that, the voices over the radio, the helicopters overhead.
Look who's here, the grunts. Trying to get to the center first to skim all the cream. Guess what? We're soon going to be there too. Move it, Frank. Awesome! -1.
It was a sobering moment when I realised the setting and what is happening in the Ukraine today. The fact that the spectre of a potentially nuclear conflict has risen again in 2023 just makes the game's setting all the more relevant. People of my generation grew up with the Chernobyl meltdown as recent history. We studied it as current affairs. But a second disaster could never occur, surely. Not after the fall of the Soviet Union and the gradual democratization of Russia's western reaches. The danger that the planet is currently in is obvious. There's a war happening around it. That's the plot of Shadow of Chernobyl, kind of. A second unexplained disaster took place after the first, resulting in the creation of an area where the laws of physics seem to have broken down. There are radiation anomalies along with mutated creatures in this area that has come to be known as the Zone, which is roughly analogous to the real exclusion zone created in the aftermath of the real-life disaster. Treasure hunters known as stalkers travel this region seeking fortune, the primary motivator being these physical anomalies that are left behind in areas of high radioactivity. The rarest of these fetch a handsome price, but as the story progresses you learn about the real prize. At the centre of the zone in Reactor 4 there is a mysterious monolith that is said to grant wishes, whatever the stalker who reaches it desires. I won't say any more about the story, but it almost feels to me like a modern day fairy tale. It's a search for the Golden Fleece or the Holy Grail or the pot at the end of the rainbow, set against this backdrop of grim modernity. No yellow brick road, instead there are strips of cracked concrete meandering through abandoned tower blocks. The game still hums with this foreboding atmosphere. Everything is oppressive and bleak, and I've played few games where the environment itself, the world, is so deadly. You're in danger of running into patches of radiation all the time, swirls of latent energy spring up like dust devils, lethal static electricity crackles across your path. Even if you're not damaged or irradiated directly, there's the constant clicking of your Geiger counter when you near an anomaly. The sound design is a mixed bag. There are brilliant elements like this which ramp up the tension. But then there are annoying elements. The bar in Rostock, for instance, with these repeated lines of dialogue, and if I never hear this song again, it will be too soon. Then there's the game's storms, which are realised really well, but those storms also rain radioactive particles down, so you have to run for cover. Most games, they're just afraid to harass the player constantly in this way, fearing that they will quit. Not Shadow of Chernobyl. There are a few safe zones, really, and it's a blessed relief when you reach them, but these are also precarious. No good guys really exist in the zone, just factions with different agendas, and although the most benign of these have created these regions of safety, you can easily imagine the dozen or so guards being overwhelmed by a determined group of bandits. You even have to help these factions on several occasions, and without your intervention, there's no doubt they would have been slaughtered. Nowhere feels really safe in this game. The town of Rostock, where the duty faction holds sway, even that is oppressive. There are constant recruitment messages over the tannoy to join duty, and the first warehouse that you wander through, there's a strategically placed guard that tells you to get lost every time you enter.
Get out of here, stalker.
It's for this reason I found myself falling into a pattern of play with S.T.A.L.K.E.R that's unusual for me. Basically, I had to take regular breaks. I found it difficult to endure this crushing sense of foreboding for more than an hour at a time, and I'm someone who will happily sit at my computer and play all day if I have that luxury. Not this game. I had to get up, walk around, dispel that fog of anxiety that was building up in my mind. That sense of unease might be compounded by the correct decision, I think, to not localize the ambient Russian language spoken by the NPCs.
Я же говорил, брешут, что тут аномалия.
All the signage and writing in the game remains in Russian also, so too the bullets in your inventory. The abbreviation for armor piercing, for instance, is the Russian word for that. The important story moments and the characters speak English, but the fact that so much of what the bandits and other NPCs say is in that foreign language reinforces the sense of isolation and otherness in the player for English speakers. You are a stranger in a strange land, trying to piece together your past after losing your memory. There isn't even an option to add subtitles for those ambient barks, although there's probably a mod somewhere. There usually is. I wouldn't use it. I think it adds to the sense of paranoia. It's in the telling of the story that the game starts to show its age, possibly. You're given the general thrust of the narrative, but it meanders through various side quests and characters and becomes a little bit difficult to track. At one point, the hunt for S.T.A.L.K.E.R goes cold, and you're really not sure what to do next, where to focus. The reason for this becomes clear later, but in the moment I really found myself lost. That may have been by design, who knows. I admit I set out with this singular focus to complete the main story, and my frustration might be partly to do with that. I didn't fully immerse myself in the game's world, take my time, explore fully. S.T.A.L.K.E.R rewards this more open-minded exploratory approach, with the main story branching at certain points, and unless you're curious about the wider story of the zone, you will miss things like I did. I'm apparently not alone in this though. I received the most common ending. There are 7 endings in total. I will only say that if you want the true, or at least the less bleak ending, you have to explore and take your time. I must have learnt something over the years playing PC shooters though, since I was no longer quite so wrong-footed by the combat in the game. It remains challenging though. The NPCs are still more self-aware than your average AI. They do try to flank as a team. They take pot shots then retreat. You can't just run after these guys. On many occasions I'm like, where's that fire coming from? It's over there. Run towards him and he totally retreats. You can't find him. Wild dogs charge at you, then lose their nerve and peel off. That hardly ever happens. Usually things just come charging straight at you, particularly dumb animals. But no, these dogs, if you turn towards them, sometimes they will run off, sometimes they will bite your face off. It depends. The AI has a choice about what it wants to do. These various spawns throughout the world, they interact in realistic ways. So groups of animals will attack other groups. Random battles can spring up between different human factions. I definitely got a sense of that wandering around when I reached the first zone boundary, for instance. It was being attacked by bandits. Then the next time I came through, the duty officers were trying to fend off wild dogs. It all adds to the sense of realism. It was impressive for the time, and it's still somewhat impressive now, although the sense of really living in the world, it doesn't quite resonate as much, largely due to the dated graphics. There's too many invisible walls too that funnel you in certain directions that break the immersion of the open world. It's difficult to buy it entirely when you can see the seams so clearly with a modern eye in terms of how these various areas fit together. On that topic, the game's map remains very difficult to use, with icons disappearing, including the player's location if you zoom out too much. Really weird decisions like that. Often I found the map only compounded the difficulty of understanding how the areas linked up, and these areas are called levels rather than regions and zones, which seems like antiquated. It's kind of weird, particularly when they're trying to sell it as an open world game. In the end, I found myself largely ditching the map and trusting to memory and spatial awareness and being able to navigate instinctively. Another thing that feels laborious compared to more modern games is the backtracking. Skyrim is the most obvious example of how there's usually a quick way out of a dungeon once you've completed it, a door at the back that's only accessible once you've beaten the final boss. S.T.A.L.K.E.R, on the other hand, you have to backtrack all the way back to the surface through squads of opposing soldiers, usually, who've discovered where you are and what you're doing in the meantime, try to get you on the way out. It's more realistic in theory, apart from the ambushes that happen with such regularity it becomes predictable. There are no shortcuts, no fast travel, not without mods, and it's a slog to get back to safety. It's a decision and I don't disagree with it. It just takes a while to adjust without those modern conveniences for the player. The game's reputation for bugginess is well founded, and I have to mention that it is still buggy at this late stage. I don't know when patches and updates stopped, but it's at the stage that it's going to be from now on, and it's still buggy. Some of these issues will stop your progress. I got to a point where the NPC needed for a key main quest line wouldn't spawn. Luckily, things are well documented online. You can find workarounds, but my advice would be save often, and also look into mods. There's probably a bug fix mod. I didn't look into mods for this playthrough, but they are probably an option as well. But I've got to mention it in the review, so you're prepared if you decide to go into this game. Be prepared for those bugs. Make sure you're saving often. And what about that crazy mutant that I mentioned at the start? Well, it turns out he's not impossible to beat at all, although that first appearance is still effective. He's one of many, and you will ultimately come up with strategies for dealing with them. I played on normal difficulty, and there are 2 levels of difficulty above that, so God knows how people cope. It's tough enough on normal. The enemy soldiers are so accurate, and I could only take a couple of hits before getting into trouble without some decent armor. In another nod to realism, the game doesn't pause while you're managing inventory items, so you have to find a safe spot or learn how to apply bandages, eat healing sausage while you're running for your life. The amount you can carry is limited, with everything weighing something, including ammo, forcing you to make hard decisions about what to take. Occasionally I found myself ditching a gun mid-mission because I'd run out of ammo for it. You might as well pick up an AK that the baddies are using, because at least they're dropping ammo for that gun. This is the first game I've reviewed in a while that definitely feels retro, and therefore the question of whether you should play it in 2023 is dependent on whether the dated look is a deal breaker for you, and whether those rough edges in terms of the UI are going to mar your enjoyment over much. They didn't for me, because at its core the combat is compelling, the exploration is interesting, particularly the broken down buildings and basements in the zone. The urban areas stand out for me. I think ultimately though the game's strength is still its setting and that relentlessly grim atmosphere. For a child of the 80s, Chernobyl looms large, and the threat of another nuclear accident or even a war is never far from your mind. S.T.A.L.K.E.R seems to me to take that paranoia, that worry, that tension, and turn it into a game, to gamify it. Let's play through that feeling of foreboding. There's no wonder it's so bleak, so tense, so wearying. I have to admit that when that final cinematic played, I experienced a sense of relief. Not in a bad way though, in a good way. Completing S.T.A.L.K.E.R Shadow of Chernobyl was like waking from a frightening but wonderfully realised and exciting nightmare. I would definitely recommend it in 2023. If you're remotely interested in the roots of FPS gaming, it seems like it's been influential in terms of what you can do and where you can set a game, and worth returning to. It is compelling, and the story is worth playing through. Thanks for listening to this review, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm doing lots of these at the moment, creating a playlist for people so they can just have a watch and think, you know, maybe there's some stuff on there they wouldn't have considered, or they've always been curious about that game. Should they give it a go in 2023? So have a look at that, and I will see you in the next video. I've been Napyet. Bye for now.